Hello everybody, it's time for another Wainrider Wednesday, which means another update for the mod Total War Wainriders for Rome Total War Alexander, the original game, not the remastered version. And in this one, we are taking a look at the first of, I guess you could say, 3 Dwarven factions, or 3 factions that will have access to Dwarven units, might be a better way to phrase it. This faction we're looking at today on the campaign map is Durin's folk. Now, this will be in some ways a very brief video because the terrain owned by Durin's folk at the beginning of the campaign is literally one settlement, and we are looking at it. It is, of course, Khazad-dûm, that would, in about 100 years or 120 years from this starting date, earn its name Moria, the Black Chasm, the Black Pit, something along those lines. But at this point, it is known basically to everybody as Khazad-dûm, or at least to the dwarves, who maintain a strong presence there, it has to be said. Now, while there are 3 sort of dwarven factions in the mod and 3 elven factions in the mod, the representation of those 2 races is not at all equal. And I guess what I mean by that is there's far more elves running around doing stuff at this point in the Third Age than there are dwarves. And a lot of that has to do with the relatively ancient history going far back into the Second Age. Of course, in the Second Age, Sauron invaded the lands of Eriador, laid waste to entire regions, and the dwarves basically shut their doors in Khazad-dûm and ceased to be involved with a lot of those great events. Prior to the war between Sauron and the elves in the Second Age, the dwarves had enjoyed a strong alliance with men in the region. We are told that the Longbeard dwarves considered the territory along the eastern slopes of the Misty Mountains and the southern slopes of the Grey Mountains to be essentially their territory, and I believe that extended out towards the Iron Hills, even going way back into the First Age. Now, during the Second Age, again before Sauron's war with the elves, there was also a large, lively alliance going on between these Longbeard dwarves and men who lived in the lands adjacent, especially along the fringes of Mirkwood. This alliance between the Longbeards and the free men of the north would actually be very successful, and it's such a shame that we don't know more about it than what we do know. What we do know is found in the book Peoples of Middle-earth. I believe it's volume 12 in the History of Middle-earth series, and that is a book that I highly recommend. I know that the History of Middle-earth is not to everybody's taste. I have not looked at the majority of those books, and I own some of them and have only dipped into them a little bit here or there. Some of the books are largely dedicated to showing how Tolkien's development of his world and his stories unfolded. And as such, you're liable to find a lot of early drafts of things that Tolkien later rejected, and things that I remember thumbing through one volume of History of Middle-earth when I was a kid in some bookstore. And there I learned that originally Aragorn, Strider, was intended to be a hobbit named Trotter. I was sort of scandalized by this information, put the book back on the shelf, and did not pursue it any further. But since then, I've learned that there are some really interesting things you can find in those books, and Peoples of Middle-earth is really for those of us who are interested in the lore. Not so much the drafts of Lord of the Rings itself, but histories, legends, even some linguistic stuff. So it is really a treasure trove for that sort of thing. Anyway, in Peoples of Middle-earth, there is a fairly lengthy essay called, I believe, Of Dwarves and Men, and in that you can read about the alliance between the Longbeards and the Men of the North. Now, unfortunately, that has no bearing whatsoever on the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, at least as they're represented in Wainriders, because at this point in the mod, we're looking at a couple thousand years at least after that alliance has been essentially destroyed. So Sauron invades Eriador. Basically, it's very dark until the Númenóreans show up, but the dwarves hold their own in the settlement. They shut their doors. We don't know exactly how the alliance between the dwarves and the men fell out, but it must have been destroyed. The men must have retreated to the woods, to caves, but we know that unfortunately that alliance fell apart and did not continue. Khazad-dûm seems to have been essentially isolated from the outside world for a very, very long time indeed. Now, in the actual history, outside of the time frame of our mod, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm were compelled to retreat from it and were exiled out into the world. Your goal then, to some extent, is to see if you can do better than the historical Longbeard dwarves of Khazad-dûm. Now, you won't be doing that by being isolated, so you will need to some extent, contend with the outside world instead of just looking inward. We're still developing things like victory conditions, but I believe it's reasonable to say that among your victory conditions as the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, as Durin's folk, will be to reclaim some of the dwarven settlements that have fallen away in the north. There are settlements, of course, such as Mount Gundabad. There are settlements in the Grey Mountains. Many of these are occupied by either rebel orcs or orcs of the Misty Mountains. And so a lot of your campaign, I imagine, as these dwarves, will be taking back those places. In the actual lore of Middle-earth, there was a war between the dwarves and the orcs of the Misty Mountains, but of course that happened well into the future. I believe something like 1,000 years on from this date. And when the dwarves undertook that war, they were doing so from somewhat of a disadvantageous position. Here you have the benefit, if you choose to use it, of a strong central settlement from which to strike out. So let's take a closer look at that settlement. This is a dwarven settlement, of course, and this is, of course, your capital and your only settlement, Khazad-dûm. And you can see here, if you look closely, there are quite a few towers, structures built into the side of the mountain, but it blends in really nicely, basically with everything else here. A little bit to the south and east, you can see the pool of, is this Kheled Zaram? Yes, Durin's stone right here. The pool where Durin saw his reflection with a crown of stars, I believe. So this is as you would imagine, and then right down the road into Lorien, and on the other side of the mountains, you can access the old country of Holland, which is no longer settled. However, in keeping with the propensity for Wainriders to change things from the 4th Age Total War, you may notice some differences with regards to accessibility of the mountain ranges. One of those is that there are a few more, not passes, but crossings over some of these rivers. So that if you're playing as the dwarves and you want to go down into the southern parts of the Misty Mountains and see if there's any orc holds you can grab here, you can do so without having to swing wide all the way over towards the Grey Flood. You can access a lot of the land closer to the mountains thanks to some of these crossings. The other thing is that there is now a pass over the Misty Mountains just north of Khazad-dûm. So not only Khazad-dûm itself, but to the north, I think it's up here, you can access the mountains and cross over. And in fact, we've designed the provinces so that if you're playing as the dwarves, you can actually head north up towards the Misty Mountains without having to trespass on elven territory in Lorien. As you can see, there's a rebel settlement here, the Gladden Heights, and you can follow this all the way up into the high mountains of the Hithaglir, the Misty Mountains, of course, and then over the other side, so you can get up this flank of the Misty Mountains if you desire, or head up on this side, where you can see, again, we've added a few more river crossings, so that I think this is the Gladden River. You can pass right close to the mountains without having to get into the lowlands too much, which seems fitting for the dwarves. This will allow you to sort of access those orcish settlements again, without having to conquer a lot of territory in the woods or in the lowland territories, essentially. So the idea is, if you're playing as Durin's folk, and if you move quickly enough, you can access some of these rebel settlements, start beating the rebel orcs out of their lands, and then moving up towards places like Mount Gundabad or even Angmar, and then possibly over into the Grey Mountains. So that'll be a lot of what your campaign is focused on, I imagine. However, there will be some neighbors to take into account as you expand, and the first one will be, of course, the High Elves. Now, the High Elven faction we will look at, of course, more closely in a later video, but the thing to keep in mind is that they own territory on both sides of the Misty Mountains. So Lorien is grouped together under the High Elven faction. We'll talk about why in that High Elven video, but in addition to Lorien, the High Elves will also have some territory up here around Rivendell, of course, and then far in the west over in the Lindon region, which you probably won't ever see depending on how your campaign unfolds. But you can begin trade with the elves from turn 1, and that might be a good move to sort of break out of your isolationism a little bit and make a little cash to fund your explorations. Otherwise, your neighbors are all initially rebels until you go farther to the north. On the eastern flank of the Misty Mountains, you will find yourself quickly up against the new-coming Eotheod. These are, of course, the Northmen who have been exiled from Rovanion thanks to the invasions of the Wainriders. And the interesting thing about their presence here is that it can be fairly ambiguous. I mean, on the one hand, you might think, okay, dwarves and Northmen, they're kind of good guys, they should be on the same side, I hope they don't ever fight. On the other hand, though, you could argue that some hostility between those factions might be kind of expected or even lore-friendly. If we think of the story of Fram, for example, he is the man after whom Framsburg was named, and he is the hero of the Northmen, the hero of the Eotheod, who I believe around the year 2000 in the Third Age slew Skada, the long worm of the north. Now, it is said that in the aftermath of that dragon slaying, Fram was a bit stingy with the goods. He did not hand over the treasure to the dwarves, and as a result, some say that the dwarves slew Fram for his insult, for his insulting way of refusing to give them the treasure. You can read about that in Appendix A to The Lord of the Rings. A very interesting little story there. Now, the dwarves that Fram dealt with are not identified, but it's interesting to point out that by the year 2000, Khazad-dûm was no longer occupied and had not been for about 20 years. But we do know that dwarves from Khazad-dûm had probably fled into the north, possibly over towards the Blue Mountains, but possibly also just up towards the north, towards the Grey Mountains, where there were dwarven settlements, apparently. This would have put them in close contact with the Eotheod, who by this time had moved into the north in the territory that had once belonged to eastern Angmar. So it's possible that that conflict between Fram and the dwarves was actually a conflict between Eotheod and dwarves who had been exiled from Khazad-dûm. Although that is a contentious point. It might just as well be that they were just random dwarves living in the Grey Mountains. That might make more sense given the fact that Skada seems to have lived in the Grey Mountains possibly, and his horde would naturally be made up of items from local dwarves perhaps. In any case, some hostility between the dwarves of Khazad-dûm and the new Northmen in the region might be expected. Certainly, though, the main foe of the dwarves will be the orcs of the Misty Mountains, who are concentrated to your north. The challenge there, I imagine, will be that those orcs are going to have a lot more production capability than you do, of course, having only one settlement. At least you'll be able to build up a little bit, but so will they, and by the time you're able to reach them, the orcs of the Misty Mountains may have occupied lots of rebel territories and increased their strength considerably. They also have an ally initially in Angmar, the Witch Realm of Angmar, who we saw previewed in terms of their campaign starting position a video or two ago. Angmar then may be another enemy of the dwarves of Khazad-dûm, and it would make sense to try to ally with the High Elves and aid them in their wars in the north to secure that alliance, that trading partner, and basically destroy the ally of your primary enemy. To the west and south, however, there may be some different groups of men. We haven't talked about all of these factions yet, but there are a couple of middlemen factions, the Black Forest tribes and the chiefdom of the Angren, both of whom may be fighting over territory to the west of the Misty Mountains, roughly in your area. If one of these two factions starts moving up the Swanfleet, then you may come into conflict with them, as you would imagine. But I imagine a lot of the main concern of the dwarves of the Misty Mountains will be what happens in Eriador, actually. Is Arthedain or Arnor going to gain the upper hand and defeat the Witch Realm of Angmar, or are Angmar and the Orcs going to win the upper hand in this region? If so, you may be hard put to it indeed to defend your starting settlement and any other dwarven settlements you will have conquered. But we imagine that the dwarves, the Durin's folk faction at least, is going to be one of the trickier dwarven factions to play. The other two dwarven factions we'll look at in another video, but for them there will be a mix of recruitment options, both dwarves and men. Of Durin's folk, however, their isolationism means that they are going to be counting only on dwarven units, and that means that your path of expansion, your path of conquest, is going to be somewhat determined by where you can conquer and train more units. So that's going to limit you largely to those mountain settlements, those orc holds, those dwarven holds that you can actually make use of. Somewhat to compensate for that, we imagine that the Durin's folk faction is going to boast the strongest dwarven roster of all of those factions. It's somewhat similar to the High Elves. If you think of the elven factions as sort of existing along a continuum from very high tech but low population to lower tech but higher population, we can see something similar happening with the dwarves. This faction is kind of like the High Elves of the dwarven factions, if that makes sense. Their population growth is probably going to be lower than the other dwarven factions. Their units are going to be much stronger, but they may have a harder time expanding than those other dwarven factions. So I think Khazad-dûm, Durin's Folk, is going to be a faction for those players who really like turtling, who like fighting those hopelessly outnumbered battles against tremendous odds, taking a strong position and defending it against all comers. That's going to be probably the name of the game for this faction. But certainly my goal, if I am playing Durin's Folk, will be to head pretty much north up the Misty Mountains and try to take all of the dwarven and orcish settlements that I can. That includes taking land in Angmar, probably taking Mount Graham just for the bragging rights, and then heading along both flanks, both of the mountains of Angmar and the Grey Mountains as well. And then we'll see where things go, because there are, as I said, a couple of other dwarven factions on the map. That includes the Iron Hills, that includes the proto-settlement of Erebor, which is not, strictly speaking, an officially full-fledged settlement at this point. But then we've got some other mountains in the east, which we'll look at in another video. Those may also offer some dwarven recruitment. So at a certain point, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm may actually be encouraged to go out and colonize a little farther than you may have originally thought. So I hope you enjoyed this first look at a dwarven faction in Total War Wainriders. Durin's Folk is essentially the pure dwarven faction in Wainriders, and it'll be interesting to see how far you can take them during a period in which they did very little but were turned intensely inward, to their own detriment, it has to be said. Can you turn these guys from the would-be exiles of the later Third Age into a proper, prosperous kingdom again? Well, thanks for watching this preview of Durin's Folk. Once again, we will have updates for the mod Total War Wainriders every Wednesday for the foreseeable future. While we will be looking mostly at these campaign-type previews, we will also switch over to looking at things like mechanics, buildings, those types of things in the future. So let me know if you have any questions about Durin's Folk or any other aspect of the mod, and until the next one, everybody, take care.